Commercial use of oil was not for what you would think it would be. Most people today, when we think of oil, tend to think of gasoline. In the early oil industry, though, by the 1850s, when oil first started to be drilled and used, there was no market for gasoline because there were no cars yet. Hence, no use for gasoline. The early use for oil was actually for another purpose. That was for the use of developing artificial sources of light. Prior to this, okay, if you'd have been back in the United States 50 years earlier than that, around the time of the American Revolution or the writing of the Constitution, there was one major source of artificial light in the United States. It was what you're looking at right now, a candle. The candle was what had been used to develop artificial light, okay, for really the last 4,000 years. And it had always been enough. Reason why it had always been enough was the typical person up until the 1800s lived on a farm. And on a farm, you really don't have much need for artificial light. Essentially, the only real artificial light you use is to work your way around the house. The work day on a farm is sunup to sundown. Other than that, the only real need you have for light is to get up, go to the bathroom, find your way around your house in the dark, okay, in order to find your way to bed. Nothing really that a candle can't handle. So, if there was a market for artificial light that oil was going to be filling, that market would have to come from somewhere. And where it came from was from some dramatic social changes that occurred in America in the early 1800s. Right, the first of these was the development of what we today call a national market economy. This national market developed because of the development of new sources of transportation, such as the railroad. These new sources of transportation allowed the entire United States to be connected to each other and allowed goods to be transported across the entire country, okay, quickly and cheaply. This transportation network allowed for the development of modern factories. That is, if you can now build a factory and have enough of a market out there to buy your products to make building a factory worthwhile. In the early 1800s, you saw factories pop up in most of the transportation were nodes in the United States where major transportation systems came together, okay, such as Boston, Philadelphia, or New York. The major industry, by the way, was textiles. And these new industries demanded much greater sources of light. Okay, why? Well, for one thing, look at the picture of the factory here. The factory here is a big square building, kind of like a Best Buy or something like that. Can you imagine trying to get through that building with a candle? All right? It would not work out very well. Or even if you're in there in the daylight with windows, it would be very difficult to see on the inside. Right? However, this factory would not just be working during the daylight. This factory is going to rely on a sophisticated power system in order to power its machines. This power system is generally going to run off a boiler. And it's going to turn out uneconomical to turn off the boiler at night and turn it back on again the next morning. Hence, factories are going to have a major financial requirement to work 24 hours a day. Their boilers are going to be on 24 hours a day, so the most economical way to run is to continually working 24 hours a day. That means that work is going to be having to be done at night during the dark. So you need greater sources of illumination in order to be able to do work. In addition to that, around the factories you're going to see the development of cities. These cities are going to be housing workers that are going to be working at all hours. They're no longer going to be working according to the sun. They're going to be working according to an arbitrary clock. So the workers in these cities are going to have to get around crowded cities with narrow, twisty roads, as you see over here, and be able to find their way around in the dark. That's going to need greater sources of light than were ever required before. And on top of that, you have another dramatic social change occurring in America in the early 1800s. And that is the country is becoming much more literate. In the early 1800s, you see the birth of mass education in the United States. This mass education is going to generate a population that can read and write. And if you're somebody who works during the day and wants to read at night, you need much better light than a candle can handle. Any of y'all who ever tried to read by candlelight know this, because it gives you a headache pretty fast. Okay? If you go through ancient scholars, that is those that were around before, around say 1750 or 1800, You see a lot of those guys turn out to be blind by the time they're in their 50s. That is, trying to read by a candle does not work very well. So for all these reasons, you're seeing a much greater demand for much more effective forms of light, okay, that are going to be around by the 1830s and 40s. Initially, this demand was filled by a new fuel called whale oil. Where whale oil came from was from whales. They hunted whales such as the right whale you see here, but also whales such as the sperm whale. They would send fleets of ships after them. They would harpoon them. They would drag them to shore, cut them open, take away the layer of fat, okay, underneath the whale's skin. Actually, it's a layer of liquid, not really fat, called blubber. They would then refine the whale in the process you see here and squeeze out of there an oil. This oil could then be burned in a lamp and produce very bright light that would not produce much smoke. Exactly what you would need. So, okay, you have a need for a new product, artificial light, that is now met, okay, by a new product, okay, whale oil. One minor problem though. That's it. When people start hunting these whales, they rapidly start hunting them into extinction. By the 1840s, it was becoming obvious that the world is going to run out of whales fairly quickly, within the next 20 to 30 years. So in the 1840s, you have an energy crisis. We have had those several times over, okay, the history of mankind. Okay, that was one. We're having one right now. And in the midst of the crisis, people started to look around for other alternatives. If you still need light and the whale oil can't handle it, okay, then what else can you use? At this point, okay, society started to use something new in order to try to find an answer. And that's science. You have a new science developing called chemistry. Okay, the leading chemist in America was a man named Benjamin Silliman. He was the founder of the chemistry department at Yale University. He also founded the Yale University Medical School. Right? And he was experimenting with new substances, especially a substance that came out of soft coal and shale. That's commonly called rock oil. He found that if you looked at rock oil under a microscope, it was composed of a mixture of several different oils, okay, that had different chemical properties. One of these layers that he found, one of the parts of the mixture, was a substance that when burned produced a very bright light, okay, that produced no smoke. He called this paraffin. Others later on would patent another name for it, called kerosene. Right? And kerosene became seen as a possible alternative to whale oil. That is, if you can get this oil, this kerosene, burn it in lamps, then you wind up having exactly what the world needs. The trouble is you have to be able to find kerosene, and no one had ever looked for it, right? Which would create a new problem, okay, whose solution would be found, okay, in the western part of Pennsylvania by a man named Edwin Drake.